Next, I'd like to talk about the PCAST report. PCAST is the President's Council of Advisors on Science and Technology. In September of this year, they issued a report to President Obama at his request about forensic science. And in the report, they talked about the lack of scientific support for many areas of forensic science, including bite marks and hair, footwear, fingerprints, firearms. They did like DNA, and they were okay with simple DNA mixtures. But despite a huge literature that shows in science the underlying foundational validity of DNA mixture interpretation over a wide range of parameters, for some reason they imposed a very arbitrary limit on DNA mixtures, saying they were comfortable with 3 contributors, but no more, and going down to contributor weights where the smallest contributor was 20% as a fraction of the contributor, but no less. There was no connection in any way to the scientific papers that they cited, and so I and others wrote letters to PCAST and pointed out that what they said had no scientific justification. Partly as a result of writing these letters, I and others were invited to go to the White House, actually the Eisenhower office complex next to the White House last month, and talk to them and meet with them about what our views were and what it was they wanted. So I'll now actually tell you what I said because I had prepared my remarks as a written statement when I went in. And initially, when the meeting started and the co-chairs of PCAST, Dr. John Holdren and Dr. Eric Lander, came in, Dr. Lander said, "Oh, let's dispense with the presentations and get right to business." But Dr. Holdren had looked at my PowerPoint slides and said, "This looks like a pretty hard-hitting presentation," and he wanted to hear what it was I had to say. So I'm going to say exactly what I said, basically word for word, because as it's posted on our website, and as you're about to hear, these were the prepared remarks that I had. Thank you for inviting me to present at PCAST. Today, I will be talking about transparency in DNA evidence. Forensic analysis of pattern evidence attempts to compare the data from one item to that of another item. This comparison is mathematically implausible, as DNA evidence has shown for the last 2 decades. Valid comparisons must be made between the types that underlie observed features. DNA mixtures arise when 2 or more people contribute their genetic material to the same item. Long ago, the Justice Department's Federal Bureau of Investigation, the FBI, developed mixture interpretation methods. These old approaches apply thresholds that simplify evidence data. The FBI's data analysis does not separate out contributor genotypes. Altering data introduces potential for bias. Comparing unseparated data with a person's genotype is not meaningful. The TrueAllele solution is to unmix the mixture. Starting from the original data, Bayesian probability modeling separates out the genotypes of each contributor to the mixture. Genotype uncertainty is represented using probability. Afterwards, a separated genotype of one item is compared with a separated genotype from another item. This comparison gives a valid Bayesian likelihood ratio, or LR, match statistic. The TrueAllele philosophy dates from 1999. First, the computer uses all the data without adding or removing. Second, the objective approach based on separation does not consider a suspect's genotype. Third, TrueAllele's unmixing process works the same way for investigative and evidentiary applications. The TrueAllele match statistic is neutral, providing either inclusionary or exclusionary results that are based on the evidence. For over 10 years, scientists have conducted TrueAllele validation studies based on identification information. 34 studies have been completed so far. These show TrueAllele's accuracy by establishing specificity, sensitivity, and reproducibility. 7 of these studies have been published in peer-reviewed journals. Yet most mixture interpretation methods have never been validated. A 2015 TrueAllele validation published in the Journal of Forensic Sciences demonstrated TrueAllele reliability for interpreting DNA mixtures containing up to 5 unknown contributors down to 1% mixture weights on amounts as small as 1 human cell. Several TrueAllele validation studies have established a statistical relationship between a contributor's DNA quantity and the match statistic. On a logarithmic scale, the likelihood ratio is proportional to the amount of DNA. Moreover, TrueAllele maintains the same linear slope under varying conditions. Analysis of covariance proves this occurs regardless of the number of contributors, the mixture weight, or the amount of a contributor's DNA. Such empirical validation shows there are no limits to TrueAllele's applicability. As mixture data becomes less informative, TrueAllele yields less identification information, whether inclusionary or exclusionary. However, the inclusion methods promoted by the FBI never worked, nor were they ever validated for match information. In the FBI PopStat software, combined probability of inclusion, or CPI, using a threshold produced unreliable results. The Commerce Department's National Institute of Standards and Technology, or NIST, showed this unreliability in a 2005 study, which they never published. The FBI introduced a second stochastic threshold, which is an oxymoron, hoping to resolve CPI's false positive flaws. However, that simplistic correction, unsupported by data, also failed. Government agencies have been floundering for almost 20 years with their DNA mixture analysis. They simply have no expertise in the modern statistical computing required to solve these problems. Some employ unworkable methods, while others adopt foreign commercial products developed by people they know. But these interpretation approaches continue to ignore evidence data. The methods use simple models for familiar workflows. Commercial ties pose conflicts of interest. Government is accruing a huge liability from years of bad science, causing bad justice in countless cases. Much of the PCAST report is insightful, but some of the probabilistic genotyping findings similarly ignore good data and science. Scientific studies show that CPI doesn't work. Basically, the method just counts up the number of reported tests. For every 2 loci tested, on average, CPI multiplies another factor of 10. There is little correlation between CPI and identification information. Unfortunately, some continue to promote CPI. A recent paper in BMC Genetics highlights a nexus between the New Zealand ESR company that develops StarMix, the NIST regulator, and FBI views. The paper contains no data, no results, and has no scientific support for its conclusions. Yet it was accepted by the journal in under 2 weeks and published in under a month, which is not typical of independent peer review. Peer review can favor established interests even when reported findings are not credible. This was seen in an International Society of Forensics and Genetics, ISFG, paper published this month. The nexus of NIST and ESR appeared again in the first authors. An ESR vendor helped write international recommendations for regulating his own commercial DNA mixture interpretation software. The ISFG paper was accepted and published in under a week, suggesting a rubber stamp rather than rigorous peer review. PCAST has raised concerns about manufacturers conducting peer-reviewed studies. However, independent peer review has addressed financial conflicts in science for a century. Scientists typically receive grant funding, which support their jobs and reputation. Removing all funded research papers from their resumes would erase their credentials. This situation applies to academic PCAST members. Thinning their resumes this way would effectively disband the council. DNA identification science is evidentiary, not prosecutorial. PCAST uses incorrect language here. Of the 400 DNA cases I have consulted on, 10% have been for the defense or innocence projects. Reliable match statistics can exclude defendants or implicate others who are guilty. TrueAllele is neutral and does not take sides. Pinkins was wrongfully convicted for a rape he did not commit and spent 24 years in an Indiana prison. DNA mixture evidence developed 15 years ago was not resolved by failed FBI methods. This year, exculpatory evidence developed by TrueAllele reanalysis of the same DNA data freed an innocent man. The unsupported PCAST findings on limiting TrueAllele's validated applicability would have ensured Mr. Pinkins' stay in prison. PCAST would deny other incarcerated innocents their scientific DNA relief. In the Nick Hillary case mentioned by PCAST's report, there was no conflict between TrueAllele and StarMix. At 30 relative fluorescent units, or RFU, and most other threshold levels, StarMix excluded Hillary. However, using a higher threshold of 50 RFU, along with careful human data selection, included him. StarMix conflicted with StarMix. This happened because limited statistical modeling required data choices that introduced human bias. Government secrecy in forensic science has failed the public for 20 years. Backroom forensics makes money and confers power, but obstructs justice. Crime labs hide their evidence data to avoid scientific scrutiny and lawsuits. This lack of data transparency is the root cause of forensic DNA failure. The solution is opening forensic data for vigilant external review. PCAST could make the following helpful findings. 1. All crime lab data, past and future, must be open for outside scrutiny. 2. The FBI's CODIS database must be available to everyone. 3. The private sector solved the DNA mixture problem over 10 years ago. 4. Failed government agencies do not need more funding for a solved problem. 5. Bad government should get out of the way of good science. Thank you for your time and attention. After my 10-minute speech, there was a discussion, and PCAST's agenda became very clear. The PCAST co-chair, Dr. Eric Lander, started discussing a vast government project that would involve perhaps hundreds of thousands of DNA mixture samples and experiments, probably costing tens of millions of dollars, as an incredibly wasteful validation study to be conducted by NIST. The science has already been established. It's been done by normal science, scientists conducting independent studies, publishing them in developmental validation, and as required by the FBI, conducting but not publishing them in many, many independent internal validations. To simply ignore or reject all of the science because there's some boondoggle of wanting to give NIST tens of millions of dollars was clearly what the purpose of these artificial restrictions on DNA mixtures was all about. And it has an impact on justice and injustice, because by legitimizing what NIST wants to do gives them authority that they do not have or deserve to have. Science is done by independent scientists, not by centralized government agencies. So it seemed to me that the entire purpose of these artificial, unsubstantiated limitations on DNA mixture interpretation from validated software were for this purpose. First, to give NIST and the FBI tens of millions of dollars. Second, to concentrate forensic power at NIST. Third, to delegitimize established forensic science. And fourth, to undermine reliable DNA evidence. We've seen this in Indiana. In the Forest case, there was a totally reliable four-person mixture, and how can you convict criminals if you don't have reliable DNA evidence? In the Pinkins case, Mr. Pinkins' exoneration relied on reliable interpretation of 5 and 10% contributors. PCAST would undermine what's happening in your state. But in Washington, D.C., the problem is the solution. If you can manufacture a crisis, if you can create a problem that doesn't exist, tens of millions of dollars will flow into your agency, and you can accrue power and take it away from legitimate scientists. So looking at these arbitrary non-scientific limits, where do they come from? Why do they exist? Why would you ignore studies that have gone out to 10 unknown contributors, that have gone down to 1% fractions, and simply say, oh, we need DNA mixture limits that don't go beyond this small range? Where does it come from? Well, as seen in the August draft of the PCAST report, it was NIST who recommended these limits to PCAST in the first place. They cite Dr. John Butler, who was at that meeting, as agreeing that there are limits and concerns. But NIST is the one who benefits financially from imposing these incorrect artificial limits, and NIST benefits politically from such limits. In a normal court of law, with prosecutors such as yourselves, if the person recommending something that makes no sense is the one who benefits financially and politically from it, they would be impeached as a witness and not taken seriously at all. These limits have consequences. They conflict with the Daubert factors, as we have seen in successfully bringing TrueAllele in 2 Daubert cases in Indiana. They conflict with the testing that's normally done in science. They contradict the standard error rates that have been established, the peer review that's happened, and the general acceptance that's formed. We don't have a centralized government agency telling us what to do. Daubert requires normal science of the type that's already happened with mixtures for over 10 years. The recommendations in these limits are completely disconnected from the scientific papers about TrueAllele, StarMix, so on, that were cited by PCAST. They gave no justification for it. They just imposed it. Very importantly, imposing these limits on DNA jeopardizes every crime lab process. Why is that? Because the quality assurance guidelines from the FBI for 15 years have required labs to use processes for their chemistry, their STR kits, for their readout machines, the DNA sequencers that generate the data, for their robots. They require that there be one validation study that's developmental, done by a manufacturer and published in a peer-reviewed journal, and then other studies that are not published that are done by laboratories as internal validation studies. This is how the entire field is set up. And NIST, the same group that's been involved in creating these standards, is now pulling the rug out and saying, no, now the manufacturers have a conflict of interest. What we've told the labs to do, we retract. We've told them they didn't need to publish their internal validations. There's no room in the scientific literature for it anyway. Now that we've changing the rules on them, the chemistries, the processes, the physical measurements, the robots, everything that's been validated in a crime lab that's followed the model of manufacturer peer-reviewed publication and validation, followed by unpublished crime lab validations, will be thrown out. Every part of the forensic DNA laboratory is being undermined by PCAST. You will have no DNA evidence in Indiana or in this country if these arbitrary restrictions are taken seriously. And finally, if the best DNA goes, studies where there are dozens of scientific validations, with many of them published in peer-reviewed journals that establish what the technology can do. And by fiat, we accept that some unauthorized committee can simply blow away all the science for their own political gain and their own financial profit. If the best DNA, the best forensic science goes, all your forensic evidence is going to be thrown out from this. And I'm seeing this in court. I'm seeing how you have unqualified experts with a bachelor's degree waiving the PCAST report. And they're being taken seriously sometimes by judges who say, oh, look at PCAST. Serious scientists, thousands of papers that are referenced that are not relevant to the DNA conclusions. And they're given an authority that they don't have scientifically because it's coming out of the White House. So what can be done about it? What is it that you can do? Well, first, recognize we do have a separation of powers under the Constitution in our country. The executive branch and the legislative branch and the judicial branch are different parts of government. NIST is part of the Department of Commerce, which is in the executive branch of the president. And the purpose of PCAST is to extract money from the legislative branch to flow into NIST in order to undermine the courts and create an artificial crisis. You probably know that last month there was an election, and while President Obama is of the view of over-regulating things that don't need to be regulated in forensic science, there's a new boss that's come in, and he's not like the old boss. And in fact, your governor, Mike Pence, is in the executive branch at the White House and is now the boss of this rogue agency. And Mike Pence has normative American values. He believes in criminal justice. He believes in public safety. And he believes in avoiding government waste. And recognizing PCAST for what it is may be communicated effectively by speaking with your governor, the new vice president, and helping to overcome these non-scientific recommendations by the President's Scientific Council in the interest of values that we all share. If you're interested in learning more about TrueAllele, there's a lot of information on our website, courses, newsletters, presentations, publications, talks like this one, and you can see them on our YouTube channel. If you have questions, feel free to contact me. My information is below. Thank you very much. Thank you.